My background is in architecture, and I've worked all over the world on high-profile urban regeneration projects. Today I work across the full life cycle of development as an investor, an operator, a developer and a designer. I'm also the author, I'm very proud of this, of 2 Amazon bestseller books, Designed for Wellbeing and Student Thrive Mode. But most importantly, I'm a mum of 3 children, and they are the reason why I've become a bit of a mum on a mission to drive change in this sector. Because the reality is what we are creating in student accommodation is shaping the nervous systems of the next generation in ways that we've barely even begun to understand. So I'd like you to take a moment to think back to what student accommodation looked like 20 years ago. Some of you in this room might have lived in it. Some of you might have even managed it, and some of you may have built it. And looking around the room, some of you may not have actually been alive then. Bare walls, communal bathrooms at the end of a corridor, a shared kitchen where the primary architectural feature was a mountain of unwashed plates and a court notice board with passive-aggressive sticky notes about stolen milk and washing up. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And why did it work? Because those buildings, despite their flaws, forced us into the world. They were simple, and that simplicity unintentionally created community. Over the past few decades, our sector has undergone an extraordinary transformation. We have moved almost overnight from that fragmented mix of ageing halls and digs into a global, multi-billion-pound institutional asset class. Today, we don't just provide accommodation, we sell a lifestyle. We build cinema rooms, private gyms, podcast studios, private dining rooms, yoga studios, saunas, and even roof terraces. We are living through the most sophisticated era of student accommodation the world has ever seen. And yet, alongside that extraordinary growth, something else has quietly and tragically been happening. Students have never, ever been more distressed. So here's the uncomfortable question for our industry. Are we building the best student accommodation the sector has ever seen? Or are we building the most sophisticated environments for student stress ever created? Because right now, the data suggests it might be both. Let me show you what's been happening to the students living inside our buildings right now. 1 in 3 is experiencing clinically significant anxiety. Almost all feel lonely, and 1 in 5 doesn't even have a single close friend. Most are not sleeping properly, and 1 in 3 have reported suicidal thoughts in the past year. Around 40 to 50% report persistent stress that interferes with daily functioning. Antidepressant prescriptions among 18 to 24-year-olds have doubled over the past decade. And 3 in 4 have considered leaving higher education with stress and poor mental health among the leading causes. This is not a generation of young people failing to cope. This is what happens when human beings are placed in environments that overwhelm the nervous system, weaken connections, and disrupt the basic conditions that are needed to thrive. Historically, student accommodation was a logistical service. It solved a simple physical problem. Where do students live whilst they study? The model was simple. Provide a bed, a desk, and shared facilities, basically a roof over their head. The real university experience happened elsewhere. It happened in the lecture theatres, the libraries, the SU bars, and the quads. The accommodation was just the place that you returned to when the day was over. But during that same 20-year period that our property model professionalised, something else changed the physics of campus life. The device in every student's pocket, the device in everybody's pocket. 20 years ago, a mobile phone made calls and sent text. Today, it's a television, a library, a social club, a shopping centre, an entertainment hub, and increasingly the lecture theatre itself. So let's look at a Saturday 20 years ago versus a Saturday today. 20 years ago, if you wanted to watch a movie, you went to the cinema. If you wanted food, you walked to the shops. If you wanted to see your friends, you knocked on their door and met at the pub. You had to move, you had to engage, you had to participate physically. Today, your friends are on your phone, your entertainment is on your screen, your food is on Deliveroo, and your lectures are recorded to be 1.5 times the speed. Your social world is curated through apps. You can live your entire student life without actually leaving your bed. And that completely changes the role of student accommodation. Now, this is what I call the frictionless trap. In the old, less polished days of student housing, there was productive friction. You had to walk down the hall to use a shower. You had to linger in the kitchen whilst waiting for the kettle to boil. You had to go to the library to find that journal. And in those small, annoying inconveniences, something important happened. You bumped into people. You made eye contact. You exchanged jokes, complaints, and observations about the weather. You became part of something. Those were micro-collisions, small, unscripted interactions that build the very fabric of a community. But what did we do? As an industry, we optimized relentlessly for convenience and comfort and privacy. We gave every student an ensuite, a private kitchenette, a self-contained studio, an ultra-fast Wi-Fi, on-demand everything. We removed the friction. But in doing so, what we've accidentally done is designed out the collisions. We've created islands of luxury. But for an 18-year-old away from home for the first time, an island of luxury becomes a silo of isolation. If the bedroom is now the primary interface between the student and the world, then everything inside that room matters more than we have ever designed it to. The lighting, the acoustics, air quality, layout, and sensory feel of that room. These are no longer just amenities. They are biological signals, signals that tell the body you're safe or you're not. And why is that? Because evolution hasn't caught up with 2026. Deep down, our brains are still wired for a world where the saber-toothed tiger might be hiding behind the next tree. Our nervous systems are constantly scanning the environment and asking three ancient questions. Am I safe? Do I belong? And can I relax? When the answer to those questions is yes, the brain opens up to learning, creativity, and connection. And when the answer is no, the brain shifts into survival mode, vigilance, withdrawal, self-protection. And once the brain is in survival mode, it doesn't matter how prestigious the university is or how beautiful the brochure looks, thriving becomes almost impossible. Because at that point, the environment is no longer supporting the student, it's working against them. Every design choice quietly nudges the nervous system towards safety or towards stress. Buildings shape behaviour. Behaviour shapes well-being. Well-being shapes performance. Now, this is the real conversation that our sector needs to have. One way to understand it is through this pyramid of human functioning inside a building. At the base is biological safety. This is where the nervous system decides, does this space feel safe? Can my body recover here? And can I sleep here? Above biological safety comes psychological regulation. Now the brain's asking a different question. Can I relax here? Spaces that support this layer include warm evening lighting, quiet retreat areas, predictable layouts, and environments that reduce sensory overload. When this layer works well, the nervous system settles. Above that comes belonging and social regulation. Humans regulate each other emotionally. Isolation dysregulates us. Real community doesn't form in a 200-person auditorium. It forms in small clusters and spaces where conversations happen naturally and without performance. Above belonging comes focus and cognitive performance. Quiet study zones, natural light, acoustic protection, and organized layouts allow the brain to sustain attention. And finally, at the very peak of the pyramid, we reach growth and thriving, creativity, confidence, and academic success. But here's a critical point for our industry. Many developments start from the top of the pyramid down. They start with branding, amenities, events, the lobby, the marketing suite, the Instagram shot. But human biology works from the base up. You cannot build thriving on top of dysregulated biology. Okay, so now I'd like to talk to you about one of the most successful products in the sector, and potentially one of the most dangerous, the studio. Commercially, we all love them. The yield's fantastic, and parents happily pay a premium for the perceived safety of a self-contained unit. The product photographs well, but biologically and socially, studios can quietly become a social trap. A studio removes every single form of passive social interaction. There's no bumping into someone while making a cup of tea, no casual conversation while cooking dinner, no shared laughter drifting across the kitchen table, just total autonomy and zero incidental connection. Human beings are social regulators of one another. Small everyday interactions help regulate stress. A conversation in the kitchen, a quick hello in the corridor, someone asking how your day was. These micro moments matter far more than we realize. Without them, students can disappear into silence. We may have unintentionally created the most socially isolating housing product ever offered to young adults. If a student in a studio starts to feel anxious or low, their options are limited. They can stay in their room and withdraw, or they have to walk down a long corridor, take a lift down 10 floors, and step into a large, open communal space that only works if you already feel confident enough to belong there. And let's be honest, can you walk there in your dressing gown and slippers? As demonstrated by my AI model here, you have to be dressed and be socially on, and that's an enormous cognitive leap. In effect, we have designed a product that requires extroversion to survive, and most students simply will not make that leap. And this is where it stops being only a well-being issue. It becomes a business issue, because when environments work against human biology, the consequences are operational, financial, and strategic. Lonely students withdraw from community spaces. Overstimulated students retreat to the rooms. Sleep-deprived students struggle to regulate mood and concentration. The asset starts behaving in ways a feasibility model never predicted. Community spaces sit empty. Events struggle to attract attendance. Staff spend increasingly time managing welfare incidents. Pastoral teams become overwhelmed. Security teams deal with conflict and distress rather than simple operations. Parents lose confidence. Student satisfaction scores fall, and renewal rates quietly erode. None of this appears on the original spreadsheet, yet it affects every performance metric that matters: retention, reputation, operational cost, brand trust, and long-term asset performance. In other words, human biology always shows up on the balance sheet. If a hotel chain discovered that half his guests were too stressed to function. We would call that a catastrophic design failure. Yet in student housing, we call it a wellbeing issue. And then we design in a yoga studio and tell ourselves we now have a wellbeing strategy. We do not. What we have is a design problem, an environmental problem, and ultimately an asset strategy problem. And when we sit in boardrooms and talk about strategy, what do we usually mean? Yield, density, planning efficiency, cost per bed, exit value. And that's asset strategy, which is obviously essential. But most developments are still asset first rather than human first. We optimize for speed of delivery, and well-being gets reduced to a gym, a cinema room, or a line in a marketing brochure. Asset first asks how many beds, what sells, what photographs well. Human first asks a very different question. How does an 18-year-old feel at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night? Where do they go when they're lonely, overwhelmed, unable to sleep? When they feel overwhelmed but do not want to perform to be sociable? A building can look impressive but be psychologically harmful at exactly the same time. Every space that we design is shaping behaviour, whether we intend it to or not. Every corridor, every threshold, every ceiling height, every window placement, every acoustic decision, every blind corner, every lighting choice is doing something, is either helping a student regulate, connect and recover, or it's making those things harder. Let's talk about sleep again. Studies suggest 70% of students report poor sleep. For decades, we've brushed this off, saying, well, it's just part of being a student. It isn't. Sleep deprivation destroys memory consolidation, emotional regulation, and resilience. If we design rooms with poor ventilation, noisy air conditioning, thin walls, poor acoustics, or harsh lighting that disrupt circadian rhythms, then we're not simply building a room. We're engineering an environment that works against sleep, concentration, emotional regulation, and ultimately academic success. And the same is true of loneliness. 1 in 3 students experience significant mental health challenges. 92% report feeling lonely. Now, as operators and investors, we might look at those numbers and think, yeah, that's a tragedy, but it's a job for the University Counselling Service and not the landlord. I strongly disagree. And I disagree not just on moral grounds, but on commercial ones too. A lonely student is a student who withdraws. A student who withdraws is a student who drops out. A student who drops out mid-term is a void on your rent roll. If a student leaves in week 6, that's potentially £8,000 to £10,000 of lost revenue for that single bed. Multiply that across a 500-bed asset, and suddenly loneliness is a very expensive operational failure. If our buildings are designed with long, poorly lit, anonymous corridors that feel like budget hotels rather than homes, we are signalling to that student, you're a transient guest here, not a member. When students feel like guests, they don't take ownership. And when they don't take ownership, they don't connect. And when they don't connect, they struggle. And when they struggle, they leave. So what do? We need to move from facilities management to human management. We need to design for vulnerability and not just vibrancy. It's easy to design a bright games room with a neon light. It's much harder to design for the shy student, the international student, or the anxious student. We need to create low-stakes belonging, spaces where somebody can simply be around others without pressure, without expectation, and without having to be on. We need to start measuring something new, not just occupancy, not just energy usage, but social energy. Which spaces are alive? Which spaces are avoided? Now, we know our water consumption down to the litre, but do we know which lounges are dead zones? Do we know which communal kitchens become social anchors? If we are serious about social value, we have to start measuring the social health of our assets. Student accommodation has evolved far beyond its original purpose. We are no longer simply in the property business, we're in the people business, and that changes everything. Our buildings are no longer just places for people to sleep. They shape how students think, feel, connect, and perform. They carry the weight of mental health, academic results, and social development. It is a significant responsibility, but it's also the greatest opportunity that our sector has ever had to turn buildings into catalysts for human potential. When housing works well, when the environment actively works with human biology, when it supports sleep, when the architecture encourages those micro-collisions, and when we thoughtfully design to make operations seamless, something remarkable happens. Students don't just live in our buildings, they settle faster, they connect more easily, they sleep better, they get better grades, and ultimately they thrive. And thriving students don't just change their own lives, they create stronger communities and more resilient, more valuable assets. The students living in our buildings today are tomorrow's doctors, teachers, designers, founders, and leaders. What we are really building is the infrastructure for their mental regulation, their sleep, their capacities to succeed. So as leaders in this sector, we have a choice. The next time you look at a spreadsheet, a floor plan, or a development budget, please ask yourself one simple question. Are we creating environments that require students to be resilient just to survive them? Or environments that quietly allow them to thrive? Because whether we realize this or not, our buildings are shaping behaviour. They are shaping academic outcomes. They are shaping the nervous systems of the next generation. And that means we are not just building assets, we are building futures. Thank you.